Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon for those in Europe, Middle East and Africa. And good evening if you're dialing in from Asia. Welcome to the launch of Strategic Survey 2021. I'm Nigel Gould-Davis, the editor of the survey and the senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia. Strategic Survey is the annual assessment of geopolitics from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. This year's edition contains 35 essays covering developments in every region, and also a number of essays on cross-cutting strategic policy issues. One example this year is our work on cyber power and the escalation of cyber defenses. Another example is the formation of new geo-economic strategies by European powers towards Asia. But we have other excellent essays too. In addition to the essays and the graphics that support them, we have our data-rich strategic drivers of change. And this is a fascinating collection of data that allows cross-country comparisons on the sources of geopolitical strength and resilience. And it repays a careful study. There's lots of interesting patterns which emerge from the data we've collected. And here's just one example. The median age in China now is 38.4 years. That is now higher than the median age in the United States. That's a fascinating fact with potentially very significant implications for future societal, demographic, and even military trends. Reminds us of Kissinger's point that China may grow old before it grows rich. Strategic Survey covers the world. We can't possibly cover it in a single hour. In a moment, I'm going to ask my colleagues to offer tasters, highlights of the most significant developments in their areas of expertise. Before I do that, I just wanted to set out briefly four larger trends in geopolitics which it seems to me run quite consistently through many of the essays in this year's edition. Our Director General, John Chipman, in his capstone essay for our strategic prospects, warns against the challenges of distinguishing trends from what is merely the trendy. But here's my effort to delineate what I think are four particularly important trends at the moment. The first is the cooperation gap. There is a large gulf between the demand and supply of cooperation. There are compelling shared interests among countries that should impel greater cooperation. The acute challenge of the pandemic, of course, the longer-term chronic threat of global warming and the climate emergency, the continued need to maintain strategic stability in a nuclear age, and finally, the importance of cooperating against international terrorism, a concern that is once again on the top of the agenda following the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. Now, there have been some cooperation successes in the past year. The New START treaty between Russia and the United States was salvaged just before it was due to expire. We've seen a spate of commitments to carbon neutrality, which is very welcome. And of course, we have the COP26 climate summit coming up in Glasgow very shortly. We've seen the Abraham Accords begin to reshape the diplomacy of the Middle East. There's also a global tax treaty impending, which may tackle sources of inequality and therefore of instability. However, the larger picture, especially among major powers, is of dynamics driving tension and greater division rather than greater cooperation. So a cooperation gap. The second trend is that COVID-19 has not mitigated local tensions and local conflicts. On the contrary, several new ones have erupted in the past year. Back in March 2020, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, called for a global ceasefire during the pandemic. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. We've seen the second Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan lead to the most significant geopolitical shift in the post-Soviet region since 2014. Watch Africa as well. There's lots to worry about going on there at the moment. We're coming up to the first anniversary of the outbreak of the Ethiopia-Tigray conflict. That has very serious consequences, humanitarian, but also geopolitical. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa. The implications of a weakening or disintegration of that state could radiate far beyond. We've seen France announce at least a partial withdrawal from its own forever war in Mali. We've seen just a few days ago a coup in Sudan, and we have a very good essay on the Sudanese transition in this year's survey. So continued, indeed, more local conflicts in the wake of the pandemic. The third trend I would call the spread of securitization. We've seen, and we are seeing, growing geopolitical salience of a number of trends across borders. Again, Dr. Chipman, in his strategic prospects, calls for new norms and laws on responsible cyber policies. We seem to be far from that at the moment. Cyber concerns, the SolarWinds hack, for example, have been very significant concerns over the past year. Geo-economics as well, the political use of trade and investment flows, are not only by the West, but being used increasingly against the West by non-Western countries, particularly China. And very high on our agenda now, and again, COP26 reminds us of this, the geopolitical salience of carbon emissions and the urgent need to address that. So much more is becoming geopolitical than in the past. The fourth and final trend is that geopolitics now is becoming not something that happens outside of the West and to which the West must respond, but a force within the West itself, imposing strains within Western systems and challenging resilience. Brexit may finally have been done, but its consequences remain with us, including potentially at least for the future state of the United Kingdom. In the United States too, and we'll come back to this in our discussion, we've seen unprecedented strains imposed on political institutions. So geopolitics within the West, not just something that the West has to respond to. I'd now like to turn to my colleagues and explore with them some of the most important trends and events and developments identified in this strategic survey. I'd like to turn first to my colleague here in Washington, D.C., Dr. David Gordon, and he is the IISS's Senior Advisor for Geoeconomics and Strategy. David, geopolitics has been taking place against the background of the pandemic, but the pandemic itself has also, in many respects, become a geopolitical phenomenon. And attention has focused especially on the conduct of vaccine diplomacy. Could I ask you to explain first what we should understand by the term vaccine diplomacy?
Sure. So I think that you're absolutely right, that basically the response to COVID has been bound up in great power competition between China and the West, which has now moved into the health sphere. I think this was really kicked off by the controversy around the origins of COVID in China, and then following that by the disinformation campaigns undertaken by both Russia and China to sort of try to blame COVID on the US and on the West. So I think that's where the initial politicization began. What we refer to as vaccine diplomacy are the efforts and both competitive and slightly cooperative to respond and to maximize the distribution of vaccines around the world, and the efforts by great powers to take advantage of that for reputational gain. So that's really what vaccine diplomacy is. Who are the players in this? I think there are five, basically: China, the US, Russia, India, and the European Union. Now, China had an initial advantage in vaccine diplomacy, partially because of its success in getting COVID under control at home. It did not see a high need for rapid vaccination domestically to prevent the spread of the disease. China's main effort on preventing the spread of the disease was closing its borders effectively. So I think the Chinese got the start on vaccine diplomacy, but their two initial vaccines that they developed, the Sinopharm vaccine and the Sinovac vaccine, were actually not very effective, particularly against the stronger strains of COVID. So as time went on, I think that you got a much more competitive situation. Of course, in the Western countries, there was a direct tension between providing vaccines for domestic utilization and providing vaccines for export. And as a result of this, that right now, as we come towards the end of 2021, you have an enormous disjuncture between high rates of vaccination in the rich countries and in the more developed countries, and in China, and much lower rates of vaccination in the developing world. And so vaccine diplomacy, I think, is very much something that will continue in 2022. And right now, in China in particular, they are trying to develop an mRNA vaccine that will be able to be more competitive against the vaccines that have been developed in the West.
Thank you. So you paint a picture of a vaccine diplomacy which is still unfolding, whose
Yes.
outcomes we can't yet determine. Is it possible to make any predictions at this point about who might win or lose vaccine diplomacy?
So I think 2022 is going to be a very competitive scene on vaccine diplomacy. So China is into the game much more heavily, as is India. So India has been one of the world's largest producers of vaccines historically. They're very much in the game. The Russians as well. So I think right now that you had initial advantage to China for being out there first. Then China slipped because of the lack of efficacy of its vaccines, and the West got ahead. But the West right now is concentrating its vaccine production on reinforcing the initial vaccines for their domestic populations. And so I do think that gives a chance for China, India, and Russia to get back into the game. I think the big question will be, can you turn these efforts that have been overwhelmingly competitive to something that is more collaborative? And it's not always the case that rivals have seen diseases as a territory of competition. In the 1950s, there was a lot of collaboration between American and Soviet scientists in developing the oral vaccine for polio. So will there be an effort by the United Nations and others to try to shift this competitive arrangement to one that involves a higher degree of cooperation?
Excellent. Thank you very much. And indeed, that was one of the most striking points I found in the essay on vaccine diplomacy in this year's survey, that there's less cooperation and more competition now than in the case of global disease management in the past.
Yes.
It's really, really striking. Brings at that point again about the cooperation again. Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to Nigel Inkster, who's our Senior Advisor for Cyber Security and China. And I'd like to ask you, Nigel, about Taiwan, because rising tensions over Taiwan have been in the news. How serious is this? What are the drivers of it? How likely is this to lead to war?
Yes, well, as to the drivers, of course, for the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan represents a serious piece of unfinished business. It's the last of China's territories that they have not yet been able to recover. They got back Hong Kong and Macau in the 1990s. And for the Chinese Communist Party, this is both a very important strategic issue, but also, I think, a matter of honor. And I think that we tend to underestimate the role that honor can play in international relations. But this is really important for China. Furthermore, President Xi Jinping, in his concept of the great renewal of the Chinese nation, has made it clear that this cannot be achieved without completing the national reunification agenda. So it's something that's got to happen. Now, up until now, China has been saying that it is aiming for peaceful reunification under the one country, two systems formula that got back Hong Kong and Macau. But I don't think the Chinese party state is either able or willing to recognize that in the light of what's just happened in Hong Kong over the last couple of years, that one country, two systems is broadly seen in Taiwan as something of a dead letter. And the challenge that China now faces is that within Taiwan itself, public opinion is moving and sense of identity is moving very much away from a Chinese identity towards a separate identity. And China has made it clear that there are circumstances in which it would be obliged to use the military option to recover Taiwan. And of course, it has been very significantly upgrading its military capabilities with a view to being able to exercise this outcome if need be. And of course, the big unknown in all of this is what the United States might do, because the United States, since recognizing China and acknowledging the one China policy, has maintained a deliberate policy of strategic ambiguity in relation to Taiwan, leaving open the question, unstated the question of whether it would actually come to Taiwan's defense in the event of a Chinese attack. Meanwhile, under the Trump administration, we saw a very significant increase in arms sales to Taiwan, and also a greater political approximation. And this has continued under the Biden administration. Only yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a statement saying that Taiwan ought to be afforded a role, a place in the United Nations, which is, of course, anathema to Beijing. And we've seen all sorts of areas where collaboration between Chinese, US officials and Taiwanese counterparts have increased. We've seen the US Congress enacting various pieces of legislation that are designed to further this approximation with Taiwan. And you've got a lot of military activity by both China on the one hand and the United States and allies on the other in the skies above and in the waters around Taiwan. And all of this, of course, creates the potential for accidents, miscalculations, and escalations. So I think the temperature is definitely rising. I don't think anybody's suggesting that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent, but my own very strong sense is that China may be moving closer to a tipping point at which they conclude peaceful reunification is no longer an option. They're not yet there, but I think they're getting closer to that.
Thank you. If they feel they're getting closer, then it seems tensions likely to rise over Taiwan.
But it's very difficult to see how they're going to reduce in the current climate, not least because for the United States, the loss of Taiwan would represent a very significant change in its posture in the Western Pacific, and would turn the United States into a very different power. Alliance relationships would be upended. And if China were to take Taiwan and be able to take, that would enable them to project their naval power beyond the first island chain in ways that were, much more problematic and threatening for the United States. So, the United States has, a very important strategic interest here, as do some of the United States' major allies, including Japan and Australia, both of whom in recent months have stated that Taiwan is an important component in their own strategic security.
There's clearly a key issue in US-China relations, but only one of several sources of growing difference and confrontation between them. And Strategic Survey doesn't only analyze and chronicle the geopolitics of the past year, we see ahead around corners as well. So could I ask you, surveying the broad territory of US-China relations, to offer a view of how they are likely to develop over the coming year?
Yeah, well, I think that we're going to see probably a continuation of the kind of on-off situation that has emerged under the Biden administration. I think when Biden took office, the Chinese hope seemed to be that they could achieve a reset in the relations. But this would be a reset that would require the United States to undo all the activities of the Trump administration that were seen as hostile or detrimental to China's interests. The Biden administration thus far has shown no particular inclination to do this. There have been some small concessions at the edges. Perhaps the most eye-catching was the conclusion of the extradition proceedings against Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei. But they're we're looking at two very different approaches. The Biden administration has taken the view that that they can have a selective engagement with China, cooperation on issues like climate change, but competition in other areas. The Chinese line has been, no, we're not playing this game. If you want progress on climate change, you've got to demonstrate progress across the board in improving the relationship. And so there is this sort of fundamental disjunct here. And I do not expect in the coming year any dramatic moves to improve the situation. So I suspect what we will see is a mixture of actions that one or the other side sees as inimical, plus some gestures in the direction of, at the very least, putting a floor under the tensions that have arisen over the last 2 or 3 years. But certainly, I don't certainly don't anticipate a dramatic improvement in relationships. and there is always the potential for further deterioration.
Excellent, Nigel. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to Antoine Levesque, who is our research fellow for South Asia. And we turn from US-China to China-India. So, Antoine, last summer of 2020, that is, we saw a very, very serious military clash between India and China. Can you take us through that, and in particular, how those two countries have responded since, what measures they've taken, what the state of that key relationship between these two Asian giants now is?
Thank you, Nigel. You see, this is a question of utmost importance for future stability of Asia. Also, the direction, momentum, and segmentation of India-China relations are key features shaping the changing character of like-minded minilateral and other alliances and partnerships across the Indo-Pacific. So what do I mean? Well, as one essay in the survey this year recalls, a brutal brawl between tens of Indian and Chinese soldiers in a high Himalayan ravine in Ladakh on an icy night of June 2020 made headlines around the world for its death toll, unprecedented since 1967. And new images of this moment emerged on social media in China only a fortnight ago. This single event sent India-China relations into their most serious crisis since China won in 1962 a short, limited war against India across the same largely undemarcated, ill-defined and contested border separating Asia's two giant neighbours, now both nuclear-armed. Tensions on the border have flared up before, notably in 2017 at the tri-junction with Bhutan. But this time, instead of coming and going, a military build-up is obvious, lasting, and consolidating on both sides of the border. 16 months on from the Galwan Valley incident, this build-up is both the result, and I think growingly the cause, of a durable freeze so far in all but the most essential crisis avoidance diplomacy between two countries vying for influence over the future of Asia, and whose leaders, we should not forget, were still meeting in a display of bonhomie as late as 2019. The essay discusses how this stunning reversal of circumstances has left a vacuum on the border as both countries, in effect, have walked back from formal bilateral commitments of a series of rules of the road understandings, preferring now, both as a matter of choice and necessity, perhaps particularly in India's case, to rely on shakier political understandings and self-restraint instead. Neither country wants war, but both are resigned, at the very least, to a prolonged state of elevated antagonism. So this seemingly steady, though not yet runaway, accretion of modern military equipment on the border, as well as the acceleration of sole military and dual-purpose infrastructure building, all mapped now on your screens, and overall to China's broad advantage, run a greater risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation. And Nigel before me pointed to that in another context. China's new border law, which will be effective at the new year, appears to only officialize an already effective ground reality in that sense. Local de-escalation agreements in February and again in August this year have done little to walk back both countries from a costly stalemate and test of their overall strategic patience. Now, beyond this outlook of those deep-seated, prolonged India-China tensions, I cannot answer your question, Nigel, without touching on another major theme of this particular essay, how tensions have reinforced India's pre-existing determination to seek reinforced security-led, if not close to strategic, partnerships with like-minded countries across the Indo-Pacific. US-China ties, in particular, reached new highs during the period out of favour of a high-powered 2+2 in-person meeting of foreign and defence ministers in New Delhi, marked by the conclusion of the last of a handful of so-called foundational agreements which unlock, from the US perspective, more advanced military-to-military cooperation with India. The country is willing to shed some of its strategic autonomy for offshore balancing benefits, but not to the point of becoming a formal US ally. The next 2+2 meeting is in December and worth looking towards in that respect. Also, by now, 2 meetings of the Quads at the leaders level, shadowed by growingly complex annual Malabar exercises at sea, have completed this step up in US-India ties in a wider context of counter-challenge to China in the Indo-Pacific. I'll stop there. Over to you, Nigel.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So clearly a set of consequences and dynamics now driving the very significant build-up of infrastructure on both sides. But in addition, that very important point you made about diplomatic innovation by India in particular. So many moving parts there. Excellent. That's something to watch closely again as we try to see around corners. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Irene Mir, who is editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, which had its own launch just a few weeks ago, and the Senior Fellow for Latin America and Conflict, Security and Development. Irene, could I start by asking you how the COVID pandemic has exacerbated sources of instability in Latin America?
Thanks, Nigel. It's a very good question. I would say that the pandemic has been probably the biggest external shock in memory for the region. It has multiplied pre-existing sources of economic, social, and political instability, and it will no doubt act also as a catalyst for further instability. So I'm not very optimistic in that sense. Just to give you give you some number on the size of the challenge for the region accounts for 8% of the world population, but also accounted for 20% and 30% respectively of global infection and death, with countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Peru performing particularly badly in containing the health emergency in 2020 and also in the second waves in 2021. Reason for that really is the toxic mix of high level of informality in the region, around 60%, coupled with high level of urbanization, but also underdeveloped social security nets and fragmented also and underfunded healthcare systems. All these coupled with limited government efficiency and also very limited fiscal space, which really provides the fertile ground for the pandemic to propagate in the region. The pandemic in general has highlighted the deeply ingrained structural flaws in the economic model followed by the region until now and prevalent in the region, which has resulted in very high level of widespread inequalities in the region and also stagnant growth. So if I go back to the different type of stability that the pandemic has impacted, starting with economic stability, the pandemic actually plunged the region in the biggest recession in recent history. Last year, in 2020, there's been a contraction of 7%. And even if GDP is going to rebound this year, obviously, the regional output won't go back to its pre-pandemic levels before 2023. And for GDP per capita, even later on in 2025. And this is actually something that it's actually much worse than the rest of the world. So also the legacy of the pandemic on economic stability will be on the fiscal scars is going to leave. Obviously, the government of the region have reacted with emergency fiscal stimulus to the pandemic. This has actually resulted in level of debt that are now around 70% on average. This is something like 10 percentage point more than in 2019. And you have also countries like Brazil, El Salvador, Argentina, Ecuador, which are practically bankrupted. So it's really a problem, and it's something that's affecting government room for maneuver and also reach at the moment, at the time of unprecedented social demands. And so some tightening will have to be done sooner or later. And this also is going to weaken also the government legitimacy and add fuel to social discontent in the region. In terms of social stability, what we have seen is also the pandemic has actually exacerbated poverty trends and inequality trends, which were already prevalent in the region. In addition, 22 million people have fallen into poverty, worst level since 2008. 34% of the population is now under the poverty line in the region. Also, the Gini index has deteriorated from already a very high level. Unemployment has deteriorated as well, and especially in terms of jobs for the informal workers, migrants notably, and also youth, which were the most affected, and that is obviously creating another source of instability, of social instability, and it's also reinforcing the incentive for migration. All these, I would say, will really probably led to more popular discontent and criminal activity, and also migration flows. We have seen already social discontent and social unrest flaring up in 2019, 20, also 21, we have seen more social unrest. And I would say that this is probably something which is going to continue, given that the original grievances haven't been addressed, and if anything, the pandemic has exacerbated them. And also, considering that the recovery is still a bit uncertain, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of next wave of coronavirus, new variant, and let's bear in mind that the percentage of vaccinated people in the region is around 40%, but actually there are countries that, including Guatemala, Venezuela, and Honduras, where the percentage of vaccinated is much lower than that, around 20%. Political stability, just to conclude, I think the pandemic is going to shape the political debate and the balances in the region this year and next year. The region is actually in the middle of an election super cycle, lots of election already this year, more election in November in Chile, Nicaragua, and Honduras, and next year actually big one in Costa Rica, Colombia, and Brazil. So what we have seen in terms of common trends is that really the pandemic has exacerbated some of the trends which are actually top of mind of the electorate, including more inclusive growth model, really a bigger role of the state in the economy, and also a more forward-looking stance in general. So I wouldn't think there has been talks about a new pink tide sweeping the region, given that at the moment we have a kind of leftist government in Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. Also, we have leftist front runner in the presidential race in Brazil, Colombia, and Chile. In reality, I think the dynamics are more complicated. I think there is a lot of uncertainty, and also often has been the case of more a protest vote, and also I guess the distinction between the left-right categories are probably a bit obsolete for what is happening in the region, and I think around the world. If you look at the case of López Obrador in Mexico, which is the leftist president per excellence in the region, in reality, if you look at his macroeconomic management, is very much of a right-wing president. So this is something that we are going to see more and more going forward. What I think is also going to be, we are going to see much more going forward, is really more fragmentation in the political system in those countries, which actually will impact future governability. We'll see a lot of dysfunctional and fragmented congresses, which we will make actually the executive life very, very hard. And it could lead to crisis or paralysis. We have seen in Peru last year with 3 presidents in the space of one week, and we're still seeing it now in Peru with a leftist president, which cannot really govern because it doesn't have really enough support in the Congress. I just wanted to conclude looking at one key reflection of economic, social, and political instability in the region, which is actually migration, and it's something that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. You have put up earlier on the map of Venezuela migration. This is actually the essay we are including in the report this year, which is a very interesting essay. Venezuela migration is, especially starting from 2016, has accelerated to the point that has become the biggest refugees crisis in the region, surely, but I think also across the world, probably comparable to Syria migration crisis. I'm looking at Emil, but yes, I think he agrees with me. In the last few years, almost 5 million Venezuelans left Venezuela, and that makes around 6 million refugees and migrants of Venezuela around the world, 20% of the population. So that's actually has a huge implication in terms of brain drain. Also, what I wanted to highlight is that this crisis is actually very unique in the region because it affects countries which are mostly the neighboring countries. Colombia, as you have seen in the map, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, but also Brazil and Argentina, and the Caribbean. And actually, the problem with that is that the recipient countries are countries that are already struggling to provide basic services to their population. They don't have the infrastructure to actually welcome large number of migrants. They have large informal markets, problem with violence and gangs in some cases. They have very, very limited fiscal space, and the pandemic has actually made that even worse. Also, in terms of aid from the international community, it's quite striking if you look at the level of aid per capita of a Venezuelan for Venezuelan refugees compared to Syrian refugees is something like $125 per Venezuelan versus $1,500 for a Syrian. So really, there is a big issue there in terms of resources to cater for all those refugees. I think more in general, the huge socioeconomic tolls of the pandemic, coupled with the deterioration in the rule of law, which we have also seen this year, will actually prompt more migration crisis going forward this year. Surely, we have seen the Haitian one happening just now, but surely more migration crisis. Central America is going to remain a big hotspot also for the impact of climate change. And with that, I think I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irena. The two takeaways for the future that I take away from your remarks are firstly that a whole series of fiscal, economic and social strains have been imposed on the region by the pandemic, and elections over the coming year will be opportunities to express that, or they will impact the course of those elections. And secondly, your very clear point at the end, watch migration and the impact that has. So thank you for that. Excellent. I'd like to turn now to Emil Hakayem, who's our Senior Fellow for Middle East Security. And Emil, I'd like to ask you about conflicts in the Middle East. There are several, old and new. Can you just briefly summarize how those conflicts in the region have evolved in the past year?
Certainly. Thank you, Nigel. The year 2020 started as a pretty hot year. Intense fighting in Libya, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, a major regime Russian campaign in Idlib in Syria that was met with a counteroffensive by Turkey, and Yemen on fire, essentially. 2021 looks a bit different than that. What we've seen is a trend towards de-escalation, in part driven by the cost of COVID, whether it's a direct cost or the cost of recovery. A number of countries understand that they have limited resources and limited attention, and especially in the Gulf. So we see a greater focus on the recovery from COVID and reorienting their economies. I think the second driver here was essentially fatigue, frustration on the battlefield, where no one could decisively win, and that in a way eroded the will and the patience of various parties, but also a sense of fear on the battlefield. I think in particular the 2019 Iranian attacks on Khurais and Abqaiq, which suddenly exposed Saudi, but more generally Gulf vulnerabilities to these kinds of attacks, and the concern about an all-out war. And finally, and very importantly, a change in administration in the US, where there was a desire to extricate the US from these conflicts, to shift gears, to prioritize the escalation, and so on. So I want to split this in two, the hot conflicts and the regional competition. Now, the hot conflicts remain hot in a way. Syria is a frozen conflict where you have 5 major powers operating militarily on a daily or weekly basis: US, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. You have major zones of influence for each of these actors. You still have a massive economic and humanitarian catastrophe. You have a regime that is struggling to stabilize the situation internally and may not have the resources and the political instruments to do that. And you have a UN process that's quite marginal to the core issues. It's essentially a constitutional rewriting process that's not going far and is not really at the heart of the problem. Then you have Yemen, which, despite having falling off the headlines, is still a very burning conflict, with major fighting ongoing as we speak, and for the past year in Ma'arib province in central Yemen. The Ma'arib is currently controlled by forces allied with the UN-backed government and the Houthi insurgency, which controls the Sana'a, the capital, and much of the country, is trying to go there, feeling that the US is disengaged, Saudi Arabia is at loss because it hasn't succeeded militarily. So this is a place where to go. And what's happening in Ma'arib deserves a closer attention because of the size of the problem, whether humanitarian security or strategic. If Ma'arib falls, then in a way it's game over for the UN-backed government. You also have a continuing stream of missile and UAV attacks on Saudi Arabia on the part of the Houthis, and no signal there that Iranian-Saudi talks are leading to a change on this front. The rare bright spot is Libya, where the intense fighting of 2019-2020 led to a stalemate that then in turn led to a renewal of the political process, in part because of greater regional attention and external attention, including the return of the US in the game. And the UN is in charge there, and in a way has helped shepherd this process, but it's a very fragile one, and things can go awry quite quickly. Now, in terms of the regional competition, there has been a flurry of diplomatic activity in the past 9 months. The GCC rift between Saudi and the UAE on one hand and Qatar on the other has kind of been resolved. I think the Saudis are more keen to put that chapter behind them. The Emiratis are still not totally satisfied. But Qatar can, legitimately look and say, we survived that phase and we're back in the game and we can organize the World Cup in 2022. What you had other noteworthy developments. Diplomacy between Turkey and Egypt hasn't been conclusive, but it's a change in tone from previous years. Diplomacy between the UAE and Saudi with Turkey as well, which is quite significant. And perhaps what really grabbed our attention are the four series of talks between Saudi and Iranian officials since April of this year. They also have been inconclusive, and from what I understand, things are not necessarily going well, but these things take time. And the Saudis at least argue they're making a genuine effort, I think in large part to attract the attention and positive headlines in Western capitals after a few bruising years for Riyadh. We had in August a pretty spectacular summit in Baghdad that the Iraqis put together, bringing a number of regional partners to signal a shift in regional relations, where Egypt is coming back to the table, Jordan is a bit more active. The only external power was France, the US wasn't. But it's quite noteworthy that this summit didn't deliver anything substantive, because without the US at the table, I think it's very hard to get any traction on that. So it's important to look at these at the moment as tactical adjustments rather than a strategic shift. De-escalation is not necessarily détente. Doesn't necessarily the political muscle and commitment. The JCPOA talks over Iran are still paralyzed. It's quite problematic. Saudi-Iran talks, I mentioned earlier, will take time. The Iranian attacks of recently on the US base in Tanf show that perhaps a lesson has been learned from Afghanistan, that you can actually push the US if the US is not really interested or paying attention. There's no real multilateral and comprehensive process in all that. There's a lot of mini-lateralism and a lot of bilateralism at play. So it's all very fragile. And I would end by saying keep an eye on Eastern Mediterranean dynamics, where the tensions there over maritime borders, over energy, over strategic alignments is only worsening.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn finally to Dr. Dana Allen, who is the Senior Fellow at IISS and also editor of our celebrated journal, Survival, Global Politics and Strategy. Now, Dana, I mentioned at the beginning that geopolitics, in a sense, is coming home to the West. And Exhibit A would be the events that took place on January the 6th of this year. Could I start by asking you, how serious and significant do you assess those events to be?
Well, thanks, Nigel. I mean, you know, in a sense, this question of seriousness versus farce has been the kind of discussion, the polls of discussion in terms of how to assess the Trump phenomena since he came, you know, rose to political power starting in 2015. And the events of January 6th at the U.S. Capitol were obviously, even if they reflect deeper forces in the United States, they were part of the Trump phenomena. Certainly, you know, at least in a fundamental way, instigated by President Trump, even if he was not entirely sure what those rioters would do once they got to the Capitol. You know, right after the November election, when President Trump refused to concede the result, I wrote a piece for the IISS website pointing to his rejection of the ritual of losing presidential candidates making a concession speech in order to sort of reaffirm the idea of mutual acceptance of election results. And in this piece, I quoted from the speeches of George H.W. Bush, Al Gore, Jimmy Carter, most eloquently and movingly perhaps John McCain when he conceded to Barack Obama. And I tried to warn that departing from this ritual was not just a matter of decorum, but would be something much more serious. And then on January 6th, I think we saw just how serious. Now, polls consistently show that a majority of Republican voters do not believe Joe Biden was actually fairly and legitimately elected president. And I think we can look at this as a stage of descent or decay of American consensus. You know, this is a deterioration that's been ongoing, arguably, for at least 2 decades, but it has gone in stages from sort of unbridgeable polarization over the purposes of government and American society to now refusal to accept the basic idea of majority rule, which is that you can impartially hold an election, transparently count the votes, and declare a winner who will be mainly accepted as such, even by those who don't particularly like the winner or the result. And for the present, we've lost that basic agreement or compact that's really at the heart of any functioning democracy. And whether we're going to get it back in 4 or 8 or 20 years is, I think, really an open question. The 2024 form of that question revolves around what I guess I would say was the reassuring fact that in 2020, key Republican state officials held firm against pressures from President Trump and from his allies to somehow reject or annul their respective states' results, or even just to cast doubt on those results, which could have been used for more turmoil. A famous case was the Georgia Secretary of State, who endured a lengthy phone call from the president on the Saturday before the insurrection, but who refused to budge in his insistence that the Georgia results were in fact untainted. What's less reassuring is that in the intervening 12 months, many of these same officials have been hounded or even driven from office by the Trump faithful, including even by Republican members of Congress. The most notable target in this regard was Wyoming Congressman Lynn Cheney, daughter of the former vice president and no particular liberal herself, who was ejected from the Republican leadership because she refused, essentially because she refused to shut up about her view that that the big lie, that Trump's big lie of a stolen election is a real threat to American democracy. Over those same 12 months, Republican legislatures in 19 states have passed 33 new laws that putatively address the supposedly stolen election. So they include provisions making it harder to vote in the first place. And this is to deal with what's really an overwhelmingly imaginary problem of voter fraud. But more ominously, they include provisions to shift authority over certifying state election results from nominally impartial, even if they're partisan, but nominally impartial officials like the Georgia Secretary of State to partisan state legislatures themselves. So, you know, it's not possible, I can't say certainly what the full practical effect of these new laws will be. But I can say with some confidence and a great deal of dread that if the 2024 election is close and contested, then we could very easily have a real constitutional crisis in America. And, you know, just to finish, the other reality is that in a closely and fiercely divided society, Donald Trump or a Trump-adjacent figure could certainly win the presidency again legitimately. I don't consider that likely, but I certainly see it as plausible. And if it happens, you know, after everything we've been through, it's difficult not to be concerned about how a second Trump administration would behave as sort of steward of American democratic norms, roles, and institutions.
Well, thank you. You paint a compelling, I have to say, alarming picture of January the 6th as not so much a moment as potentially at least a prelude. And again, questions of stability, resilience, or democratic collapse are questions that in the past the West has only asked about other countries and not about itself. But it seems to me, on the basis of what you said, we're entering into new territory. I'd like to ask you finally how you think these developments are affecting America's standing in the world.
Well, not positively, I think would be the easiest ways to say it. I mean, as I suggested to begin with, you know, Trump could be back in office in less than 4 years. And to the extent that that has been traumatic for American partners, you know, I think they must have some anxiety about that possible future. I mean, I think the second thing I would say is that, you know, the example of American democracy has been something maybe not taken as seriously by countries abroad as by the Americans themselves, but it has been taken more or less seriously. And it's been a source of American influence and attractive power. You know, that power is diminished for as long as the evolution of American democracy and the future of American democracies is uncertain. And, you know, I think the third thing I'd say, I'd go back to your, the first overarching trend that you highlighted, Nigel, you know, idea of a very serious international cooperation gap. You know, when he was running for president, Joe Biden promised to fix that, or to, you know, to improve that situation and restore America's role and leadership in international cooperation. But you know, cooperation internationally is very difficult if Americans can't cooperate domestically. That doesn't mean they have to agree on everything, but there has to be a minimum degree of consensus. Right now, I'm not sure whether it's today or tomorrow, President Biden is supposed to arrive in Glasgow for the climate summit. This is obviously the you know, maybe most daunting challenge of global cooperation in human history. I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but it's certainly a daunting challenge, and it needs, you know, coherent great powers that have a coherent domestic scene. You know, another example, maybe less cosmic, but certainly troubling, was mentioned by my colleague Emil, or alluded to, which is the American withdrawal under Trump from the JCPOA. It's been very hard to put that kind of that cooperative achievement back together by the Biden administration and its partners in semi-negotiations with the Iranians. But even if they do, the prospect is there that a future administration could renege on it again, because again, we have lost that, basic underlying consensus of American foreign policy.
Well, thank you very much, Dana. And with that, we have reached our full hour. There is inevitably much more to say. There is much more that has been written in Strategic Survey 2021. I encourage you to buy it and to read it. It remains for me to thank my colleagues for setting out some of the highlights of this exceptionally eventful geopolitical year and helping us to peer ahead into the future. And thank you, the audience, for spending this hour with us. Thank you.